done that, just as if he had already died on the cross. He had not yet died on the cross, but he knew as the Son of God that he was going to do that. You know, there were times when God in his Word talks about things that he was going to do, but talks about them in the past tense. That's how certain it is that those things are going to happen. And that's much of the same as Jesus is talking about here. Yes, his dying on the cross was in the future. And, hanging on the cross, remember we talked about the time we studied in Mark chapter 15, and the 7 statements that Jesus made on the cross. When hanging on that cross, he said, "It is finished. Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit." And then he bowed his head and gave up the ghost. But now we get to Mark chapter 16. And knowing that Jesus here this was, like I said, if he had not raised from the dead, we would still be in an unsaved condition. But I want us to notice a couple of things as we look at this chapter tonight. And they kind of stuck out in my mind as I studied these things. One of the things that I want us to look at and remember is the disbelief of his disciples. Jesus had told them that I am going to die on the cross. Jesus had said, and after 3 days I'll be raised from the dead. And he had told them and he had taught them that, and they had seen him perform miracle after miracle. In some cases they had heard the voice of God from heaven. And then some of them had also seen Jesus transfigured with Moses and Elijah, and seeing all of those things and then hearing the voice of God there, but still they struggled with belief. And you think, well, David, how do you know they didn't believe? Well, the text tells us they didn't believe. Well, let's begin reading in chapter 16 of the Gospel of Mark in verse 1. Now when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices that they might come and anoint him. There's your first evidence of disbelief. What were they going to that tomb? What were they expecting to find when they got to that tomb? They were expecting to find the body of Jesus in that tomb. Going into verse 2, it says, "And very early in the morning on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb when the sun had risen." And notice what they were saying here. "Who will roll away the stone from the door of the tomb for us?" Who's going to roll the... See, they were expecting Jesus to still be in that tomb. Even though they had said that Jesus had taught them, "I am going to be raised from the dead. After 3 days, I won't be in that tomb anymore." And, they were struggling with that. And, folks today may struggle with that disbelief because what we are asking people to believe is something that they have never seen in their life. Right? Now, some of them had seen people raised from the dead because Jesus raised some of them from the dead. Lazarus, the widow's son from Nain, raised him from the dead. We don't know if, there may have been others, but we know of those. And so they knew it was possible, but yet they were still struggling with it. Because, you think about what the Pharisees and the elders and the priests and the high priest, what they were thinking when Jesus died on the cross. They were thinking, we've won. It's over. And in the minds of some of his disciples, the same thing was going through their mind. They're going to anoint his body in the tomb, and who's going to roll away the stone? Now, we also know by going back in the book Gospel of Matthew that there was an earthquake, and the stone was rolled away, and those that were guarding the tomb became as dead men. And so keep in mind, this is the second earthquake around Jesus' death. You know, sometimes we forget about this one. You know, we remember the earthquake when Jesus died and the temple, or the veil in the temple tore from top to bottom and the graves were open. But this was the same thing. Not the same earthquake, but it was another earthquake. And why did all of these events occur around the death of Jesus? You know, why did God cause the sun to go black? Why did God cause the earth to shake? And even here, why did God, in rolling away that stone, why did he cause the earth to quake? I think it was God saying, hey folks, look at what I'm doing. Getting your attention. Here's what I'm doing. But yet they were still struggling with that ideal. When they get to the tomb, they realize, they see the stone has been rolled away. And Mark also adds a little note here about the stone, that it was very large. It wasn't just some little stone that, you know, could just roll away by itself. It had to have some power, some that could move that stone away from that tomb. And then let's keep reading in verse 5. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a long white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is risen. He has been raised from the dead. He's not here, he goes on to say. See the place where they laid him. Now when they walk in, you know, they realize the tomb is open. They see this young man, and then the body of Jesus is gone. Now we can look at the other Gospels and see the encounters that they have, you know, with Mary and her seeing Jesus there in the garden, or where the tomb was, and not really recognizing who he was, and, you know, but then notice what else happens here. But he says in verse 7, but go, this is the young man talking to him, but go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him as he said to you. Two things here I want us to think about. He told them, go tell the disciples. And tell them that Jesus is going to meet them in Galilee just like he told them he was. And you also tell Peter. Why did they single out Peter? Why was Peter here singled out? And I think Peter may be at this point feeling like, since he had denied Jesus 3 times, he may have been thinking, perhaps I don't need to go to Galilee. I've messed up. And perhaps I don't need. But now he's making a point to tell Peter, you come too. Then we go on in verse 8. So they went out quickly and fled from the tomb, for they trembled and were amazed. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now all of these things that they had seen, all of these they had been told were going to happen. They should have been expecting these things, but yet they still had that little bit of doubt. You know, Mary Magdalene had been healed by Jesus. He had cast 7 demons out of her. But now there's still that little bit of doubt. Now, let's continue reading in verse 9. For now when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he cast 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him. Here's another reason they doubted. What were they doing? They mourned and wept. They were mourning the death of Jesus. This should have been a day that they were looking for. This should have been a day they were longing for. The resurrection of Jesus, knowing that he had died 3 days ago and on the third day he was going to be raised from the dead. This should not have been a day of mourning. It should have been a day of happiness, knowing that he was going to be raised from the dead. But they were mourning and weeping. And then verse 11, Mark just comes out and tells us, and when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, Mary Magdalene, they did not believe. They didn't believe. Again, think about all the things they had seen. And then yet they still doubted. You know, we give Thomas a hard time because, you know, we call, what's his nickname? Doubting Thomas. Because he made the statement, you know, unless I put my finger in the nail holes and my hand in his side, I will not believe. But you know, if you continue reading in that passage, the others doubted too. And here, this shows us that they doubted. They struggled with believing that Jesus had raised from the dead. What good does that do you and I? When the devil inches that little bit of doubt into your mind, don't think you're the only one that ever doubted. Because he'll do it. The devil he will get that screwed into your brain as best he can and say, you know, do you really believe that someone died on a cross, was buried and laid in the tomb for 3 days, and then was raised and was alive again? Do you really and truly believe that? You don't think the devil works on that? That is beyond all logic for you and I. It's beyond all possibility for you and I unless we have faith in God. We trust in God, we believe what God said, and we believe that he raised his son from the dead. You know, we continue reading in verse 12. After that, he appeared in another form to two of them that walked and went into the country. And you can go into Luke chapter 24 and read about the men on the road to Emmaus. You remember those men? Jesus, they were walking and they were talking about all the things that happened. And these two men, then Jesus began walking with them. And they didn't recognize who Jesus was. And, you know, Jesus was listening to them talk. And he says, you know, what are you talking about? And they kind of made the statement, man, are you the only one in the world that don't know what's happened this past week? Are you the only person in this country that don't know that Jesus was crucified on the cross? Are you the only person that don't know that? Are you the only person that don't know there was an earthquake? Are you the only person that don't know the sun didn't shine for 3 hours in the middle of the day? Are you the only person that don't know that the veil in the temple ripped from top to bottom? Now, they didn't say all that, or we don't have all that recorded, but that's kind of the gist of what they were saying. All of the things that had happened, you don't know that? But then continue reading in verse 13. And they went and told it to the rest. Now, you remember what happened when they were walking on the road to Emmaus? Jesus then revealed himself to them. And then they, says here, but they did not believe them either. The second group of people, Mary went and told them. Now, these two men that seen Jesus on the road to Emmaus, they go and tell the disciples, and what happens? They don't believe him either. These folks are struggling with the fact that Jesus had been raised from the dead. Then, in verse 14, and I know we're skipping over a bunch of stuff that happened, and we just don't have time to cover all of that, but You can read the other three Gospels and get a more full, detailed account. But in verse 14, he says, later he appeared to the 11, and they sat at the table. And notice what happens. He rebuked their unbelief and the hardness of their heart, because they did not believe those who had seen him after he had risen. Jesus, tell him, why didn't you believe? This is exactly what I told you was going to happen. This is exactly what the prophets in the old law had been telling you about. This is it. You should have recognized that. You remember what Peter said on the day of Pentecost when they were confused, when they received the power of the Holy Spirit and they began to speak and the people there thought they were drunk? What did Peter say? Peter said, these men are not drunk, but this was spoken by the prophet Joel. These are the things that are going to happen. And Jesus, told his disciples it had been prophesied about him, and yet they failed to believe. And Jesus rebuked their unbelief. Even from people who had seen him. But yet, Jesus still was raised from the dead. Now we know by reading the other accounts that, Peter was restored. Peter, you remember, Jesus asked Peter, Simon Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, yes, Lord, I love you. And he asked him that 3 times. And Jesus gave Peter instruction to feed his sheep. And that's the same instruction that you and I receive today. In verse 15, Jesus begins to tell them what he wants them to do in a more detailed setting. He had already been teaching them, but here in a more detailed, he says, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He who believes and is baptized will be saved. But he who does not believe will be condemned. Now, there's a lot of people that look at that verse and say, well, if, believe in baptism and then it just says if you don't believe you're going to be condemned, that's a stretch. That's looking for an out. If you want to be saved, what does he say? Believe and be baptized. If you don't believe, you're certainly not going to be baptized. So if we don't believe, Jesus said, then they're going to be condemned. But he gives them the responsibility, as well as us, the responsibility to go and to teach the gospel. And then in verse 17, and these signs will follow those who believe. In my name they shall cast out demons. They will speak with new tongues. They will take up serpents, and if they drink anything deadly, it will by no means hurt them. They will lay hands on the sick, and they will recover. That was the signs that would follow those disciples right there, not us. We can go to 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and we can learn that those gifts from God, those miraculous gifts, that they were going to cease. But those gifts were given to them so that they could prove, yes, we are from God, because they didn't have the written word like you and I have. And we can read of accounts where they laid hands on the sick. They performed miracles where they were bitten by serpents. You remember Paul was bitten by a serpent, and what did they expect to happen to him? They just kind of sat back and waited for him to swell up and die. And nothing happened. And they perceived him to be something more than he was. But yet those things that we understand were used for the disciples then to prove that what they were teaching was from God. And then in verses 19, it says, so then after the Lord had spoken to them, he was received up into heaven and sat down on the right hand of God. Turn over in the book of Acts and we can read about the ascension and how that he ascended up into heaven. I want you to try to visualize that in your mind if you were standing there beside those disciples when Jesus began to ascend up into heaven. What that must have looked like. And I want you to think about that for just a minute. To see someone that was standing on the ground begin to ascend up into the sky. Would that not be amazing? Would that not be something that would convince you that this man was something more than a man? That this man was truly the Son of God? Floating up into the clouds, through the clouds, and out of sight. I can't imagine how that would have made me feel, how that would have made you feel had you been standing there. You know, we talk about, well, when we get to heaven, I've got some questions I want to ask. I'd like to ask some of those apostles, what did you think when you saw Jesus ascending up into the clouds? What did you think? How much courage did that give you? Had a suggestion this morning after services that I do a lesson on having courage. And we're going to do that. But think about the courage that gave them. The confidence that gave them. To go out and face the struggles that they knew they were going to be facing. But yet they were willing to do that. And then verse 20, Mark closes by saying this. And they went out and preached everywhere, the Lord working with them and confirming the word through the accompanying signs, the laying on of hands, the healing those that were sick, drinking things that are deadly, serpents being bit by serpents and surviving. Those were the accompanying signs that showed that these men were from God. You know, you think about, we've covered the book of Mark in about 17 lessons. I think we spent 2 weeks on chapter 14, I think, maybe. But think about the things that you saw. Think about the things that were written. Think about the things that are confirmed, so that you and I can have the same confidence that they had to go out and fulfill the commission that Jesus gave them. As you go through your daily life, tell people about Jesus Christ. And when they believe, baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Tonight, if you're here and you're not a child of God and you have a desire to become one of His children, Jesus tells us right here how to do that. And we'll be happy to assist you in that tonight. And there will be rejoicing in heaven. If you're here and you've not been living your life as you should and you want the prayers of brothers and sisters in Christ, we will pray with you and pray for you. And God will forgive you. If you're